Hey guys, Beth here from Queen City Clay. In this video, I am going to show you how to make a hand-built bowl using a template. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about our template. So this template was made out of a manila folder that we found laying around the office. And I traced some circles on it, okay? So the first one I traced the outer circle, okay, using a 5-gallon bucket. The inner circle was made using a yogurt container. So I placed it in the middle, traced it, and then cut out this middle, okay? So that's gonna be basically the bottom part of my wall. And at this point, I can make different measurements on this template so that I can make different shaped bowls, all right, depending on where I attach these walls together, okay? So down here, I've got more of a low, flat bowl. Here is like a lower wide bowl, and then this is a little bit taller, but they all have the same wall height or area. Okay, so I've got my slab, and I've started by ribbing my slab really well in multiple directions on both sides, okay? So I ribbed this side, and then I flipped it over and did the other side. I'm going to go ahead and lay my template down on my slab, okay? And so I'm gonna use this, this smaller bowl size that I have here. And so I'm gonna kind of arrange this on my slab so that I can get the whole template to fit on here, and then I'll still have an area that I can cut out for the floor. So I'm gonna lay it on here, and then I'm just gonna mark with like the back end of a paintbrush where I wanna cut this out, okay? Not gonna cut it quite yet, and I'm just gonna kind of mark that this is where my wall is gonna go, or my cut is gonna go. Okay. And then I can take my template off, and I have an idea of where that cut out is gonna be. Okay, so once we have this outlined, I'm gonna use my needle tool, and I'm gonna go in and cut this out. And I'm cutting this straight up and down. Along my line. Okay, so I'm gonna take away my excess here. Set that aside. And then I'm gonna hold on to this piece because I'm gonna use this to cut out the floor of the bowl. Okay, so I'm gonna just set that aside. So now that we have this cut out, we need to address where we're going to make our connection here. Okay, so this is where the bowl is going to be connected. So it's going to wrap up around like this. So these two edges need to be beveled. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my needle tool, and I'm gonna hold my finger on the inside here. I'm gonna hold my needle tool at a 45-degree angle, and I'm going to pull it towards my finger and stop when I hit my finger. Okay, there are other tools that you can use to do this, but if you don't have like a bevel cutter at home, this is the easiest way. So for this side, we need to do this exact same thing, but on the other side, okay? So I'm going to take this piece and I'm just going to flip it over. Okay, so now this bevel is under here. So I'm gonna do the exact same thing I did on this side. So hold my needle at a 45-degree angle here. So if you can't see that, I'm holding it like this, okay? And I'm holding my other finger here at the end so that I'm basically supporting this clay and not pushing like and smushing this wall down. So I'm holding it at 45 and cutting down, okay? And if you mess up, like just cut it again. It's not that big of a deal. Okay. Now I'm gonna address the rim of the bowl, okay? So you can leave it straight across, which would be just fine. And what I would do there is I would use my pony roller and just run it along this edge, okay? So run pony roller along the edge to thin that down and make that a little bit more delicate and refined. Okay, we want to try and look out for when we're hand building dinnerware, that we are treating our rims and feet the same as we would if we were throwing them on the wheels. So we want to make sure that that rim has a nice finished edge, okay? So a lot of times when we hand build pots, the edges and rims tend to be a little bit on the clunky side. So by thinning that down a little bit with the pony roller, it kind of softens that rim a little bit and makes it a little bit more delicate. So just running that pony roller along the edge there will thin that down just a bit for us, okay? I like to go a little step further and I'll add some detail here. Okay, so I'll go along and so where that connects might not be perfect where that scallop is, so I actually am going to just take that off a little bit right there, cutting it again at a bevel. Okay, so I'll take off all this excess. And then I'll soften that back down a little bit, okay? So I can go back over that, even though it's the scallop, I can still go back over that with my pony roller, and it will kind of soften that down a little for me. And then I'll go back over it with my sponge as well. Now this sponge is just lightly damp and all the water has been wrung out of it. So I want it to be able to slide freely over the clay and not stick, but I don't want to add a whole lot of moisture to this clay, otherwise it will weaken the walls of the clay. Okay, so just kind of smoothing all that out and getting it cleaned up. Okay, so I've just moved this onto a turntable so you can see this a little bit more easily, but at this point I'm going to score my two beveled edges here. Okay, so I'll dip my scoring tool in a little bit of water. I don't really need much more than that since this clay is so fresh. I mean fresh out of the bag, so it's pretty wet still. So just a little bit of moisture added to that is plenty. So I'll do that side and then I will gently lift this. And if it sticks a little bit to your board, you can get a rib underneath and just lift that edge. It's probably best to be working on a piece of newsprint or fabric or something so that your clay is not sticking to the surface. If you don't have wood boards to work on at home, then you can use a piece of fabric. An old sheet works great, or a pillowcase on top of your table will be a great surface to work on. Okay, so I've scored both of these beveled edges and now I'm just gonna bring them together. So I'm gonna just pick up these walls and carefully connect these. Okay, and I'm just gonna use my fingers and kind of press, like pinch a little bit together. Okay, and then I can use, I want to make sure, it's kind of tough to see, so I'll lay a piece of foam down and flip this over so that you can see it. There we go. So right here, I want to make sure that this gets all the way over here onto this connection here. Okay, I want to make sure that that fully connects there. So the reason we're cutting it out of a bevel is that as that clay dries and shrinks, it's going to pull and shrink this way, so it will always stay connected to itself rather than connecting 2 points. If that slab was cut just straight down, then as it shrinks and dries, your slab is just gonna pull straight apart. So by cutting it at a bevel, we're creating more overlap so that clay is going to shrink and dry this way, and as it spreads apart, it will still remain connected, okay? So we do wanna reinforce this seam here, okay? So I can use my pony roller here with a tool or my finger inside of that seam to kind of press on the other side. And then I also like to use just a rubber rib here to compress that down, okay? If you have a lot of seam showing and you don't want it to show, you can use a serrated rib, okay? So this is going to, there's lots of different serrated ribs out there. This one is going to kind of displace that clay and plane that surface down for you. Okay, so you can kind of use that, and that will hide your seam a little bit better. Okay, and then just go back over top of that with your rubber rib. Okay, so now we've addressed the foot, the connection, and now the rim, the connection, and now we're gonna address this foot here. So I am going to, with this on my banding wheel here, I'm going to go ahead and give this a little bit of a trim. I've got a needle tool, and I'm just kind of leveling this bottom off a little bit. Okay, while I've got it upside down. And I'm going to go ahead and go back over this with my scoring tool and score this bottom. Okay, just dipping my scoring tool in a little bit of water to add a little moisture to it. So now we're going to add the bottom. So I have this scrap that I saved from when I cut out my template, and I have just a small round cookie cutter, and this is not a perfect size for this particular piece, but I'm just going to use it as a starting point. Okay, so I cut a circle out of my scrap, and what I'll do is I'll use my pony roller just to kind of taper that edge down a little bit. Okay, and I've scored the bottom. I flipped my bowl over and scored the bottom of it. And so if I set it on there, I can then go back in with the back of a brush or my needle tool and just gently mark where I'm gonna score that on my circle. Okay, so I'm gonna pop it back off. Oops, I shouldn't have gotten rid of my foam. I'm gonna lay it back down gently on here. So when I'm picking this up and moving it around, you'll notice that I keep my fingers really wide so that I have lots of surface area touching my piece so that I'm not like grabbing and pinching it, okay? So we have our circle here and we have our mark where we trace the inside of the bowl. So I'm gonna use my scoring tool and score along just right outside of my line so I know that that's where my rim touches. Okay, and at this point I could trim back a little bit more of this, but I actually like to wait until I have it on my piece, okay? So I will go ahead, and I did just use a little bit of moisture added to the tip of my scratch wire brush here, but I can just get a tiny bit of water on a paintbrush and just wet this just a little bit more. Make sure that that's a nice connection. Okay, so I will go ahead and take this and then add it on the bottom of here. Okay, and just kind of get that lined up. And then I'm gonna flip it back over now. So I'd like to keep it on a piece of newsprint. This is a little wrinkly, but that will be just fine. And I'm gonna use my wide hands here to kind of gently lift this and flip it back over. Okay, and now that it's flipped, I can kind of roll this edge on the bottom of my piece to get it connected and compress it on, okay? So you can kind of see here that it connects, and then it also leaves a little bit of a foot. So by leaving a little bit of excess on there, it leaves that like detail of a foot, of like a carved foot or a trimmed foot. Okay, and then on the inside of the piece, you'll see that we still need to do a little bit of cleanup. So inside the piece, we still need to clean up this little area where it connects. And I like to leave that seam showing, but I will go in with a damp paintbrush and just run it along this inside. Now you can also roll out a tiny coil. So you can use just like a little ball of clay and roll out a super tiny thin coil and run it along the inside of there for support. I like to have that seam showing, so as long as you're doing all of your connections well and compressing them well, if you leave your piece covered for a couple of days to let all of that moisture come to the same level, then usually those connections will be successful and you shouldn't need to add a ton of extra support coils. So I will just run that inside of there a little bit and smooth that down, and then I'll let this get to leather hard before I go back in and just run my sponge along these edges for a little bit more cleanup. This particular clay doesn't have any grog in it, so that is a really successful way for me to clean up my edges. But if your clay does have grog in it, you'll want to do it on a little bit sooner before it gets too dry, so that you don't pull all that grog to the surface as you're ribbing it, sponging it with your sponge. If you do and a lot of grog comes up, you will have to go back over it with a rubber rib to kind of press that grog back down. But that is my bowl, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for tuning in.